I was barely past the entry doors of the hotel venue when the comment caught my ear. "Oh, perfect. Looks like the maintenance guy finally made it." The remark wasn't aimed towards someone else. It was directed straight at me. Her tone was muted enough to offer plausible deniability, yet clear enough that her immediate circle erupted into giggles. My feet froze instantly. For a brief second, I stood motionless in the grand reception area, holding my breath. I glanced down at my attire, a freshly pressed button-up shirt, polished work boots, and the antique watch my late wife had gifted me 2 decades ago. I had dedicated over an hour to getting ready that morning, given that this was far more than an average family event. My son was tying the knot. Yet within moments of stepping into that room, I felt diminished in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The person who uttered the mock comment was Chloe Kensington, my son's bride-to-be. Beside her stood her mother, Eleanor, beaming as though nothing inappropriate had transpired. A few nearby guests quickly averted their eyes upon realizing I had overheard the entire exchange. Others pretended to be occupied with their beverages. Not a single person spoke up. That is the harsh reality of public embarrassment. Most people refrain from participating, but they happily observe. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. At 62 years old, after decades of hard labor, raising 2 kids, saying goodbye to my wife, and carving out a life with my own hands, I suddenly felt like an intruder who had wandered into the wrong building. Part of me wanted to turn around immediately. In truth, I had already shifted toward the exit, when a hand rested gently on my shoulder. "Dad," a voice said. I turned to see my son, Ethan. He moved closer and dropped his voice to a whisper. "Believe me, just stick it out for tonight." That was all he offered. No lengthy breakdown, no comforting promises, just those few words. Yet there was a distinct look in his eyes. Not anxiety, not embarrassment, but a firm resolve, the kind borne by someone holding on to a secret they aren't ready to reveal. I stared at him for a moment, expecting further explanation. None came. He gave a quiet nod and stepped back toward the gathering. I remained solely because of him, not out of any desire to stay or because the crowd deserved my presence. I stayed because Ethan had never given me a reason to question his judgment. Even so, as I ventured further into the room, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was fundamentally off. Chloe greeted guests with warm smiles, accepted congratulations, and embodied the picture-perfect bride. But every time my eyes drifted in her direction, the sound of that laughter echoed in my mind. I remembered the exact look she had cast my way. Not hatred nor simple dislike, but complete dismissiveness, as if I were merely an obstacle she had evaluated and deemed irrelevant. What I failed to grasp at that moment was that the jab in the hotel lobby wasn't an isolated, careless joke. It was the initial fracture in a much larger deception. Before the weekend drew to a close, my son was going to reveal something that would completely shatter everything I believed about the woman he was set to marry. I spent the remainder of the evening doing my absolute best to act as though nothing was wrong. I shook hands, engaged in light conversation, and offered polite smiles whenever the situation called for it. Yet every so often, I would catch Chloe glancing over in my direction, not at my face, but at my clothes, my hands, and my worn leather boots. It was the exact same condescending gaze I had encountered before, the kind of judgment people pass when they have already decided who you are long before you ever speak. The strangest part was trying to figure out why it affected me so deeply. I was never ashamed of the life I had built. I had spent over 40 years earning an honest living, owned my property completely free and clear, and owed money to no one. Yet whenever the Kensingtons were around, they had a subtle way of making ordinary, honest living feel small. Perhaps that's why my thoughts kept drifting back to Martha that night. My late wife had an uncanny ability to read people better than anyone I ever knew. Throughout our 25 years together, her intuition was rarely wrong. Whenever someone was overly charming, she became cautious. Whenever someone appeared flawless, she looked a little closer. On more than one occasion, her keen eye had saved us from trusting the wrong individuals simply because she picked up on small details everyone else overlooked. 5 years after losing her, I still found myself wondering what she would think of the people coming into our lives.
If I'm being entirely truthful, I already knew the answer. The truth was that my misgivings about Chloe hadn't originated in that hotel lobby. They had actually begun nearly 18 months earlier, the very first time Ethan brought her out to the farm. At initial glance, she appeared pleasant, educated, articulate, and well-mannered. She always knew precisely what to say and when to say it. My son looked genuinely happy, and his happiness meant the world to me, so I welcomed her with open arms. I gave her a full tour of the property, introduced her to our longtime neighbors, and treated her like family. However, during that initial visit, I picked up on something that lingered in my mind. Most folks who visit the land ask about its history or the crops out of sheer curiosity, but Chloe asked questions with a sense of calculation. She wanted specifics regarding total acreage, boundary lines, water rights, tax figures, and future development opportunities in the surrounding area. At the time, I brushed it off as professional interest, knowing she worked in commercial real estate. Her questions seemed natural for her line of work, but looking back now, they make a lot more sense.
Meeting her parents for the first time made the situation even stranger. Sterling Kensington carried himself like a man who believed he was entitled to dominate every room he walked into. He spoke with supreme confidence about market trends, acquisitions, and lucrative ventures. Eleanor was different, softer, more polished on the surface, but somehow far more difficult to read. Every phrase she uttered sounded practiced, and every smile felt completely staged. They never insulted me openly. People like them rarely do. Instead, they asked subtle questions designed to highlight the gap between their lifestyle and mine. What kind of financial yields did farmland produce? Had I ever considered selling off the property? Did I ever get tired of living so far away from the city? Every interaction felt less like a warm conversation and more like an interrogation I had never agreed to participate in. Still, Ethan was happy, and that was what truly mattered. So whenever my gut warned me that something was off, I brushed it aside. I told myself I was being overly cautious, that grief was making me cynical, and that I needed to stop imagining issues where none existed. But standing in that hotel ballroom, replaying Chloe's mock comment over and over, I finally admitted something to myself that I had been avoiding for nearly 2 years. The issue wasn't that I had been paranoid. The issue was that I hadn't been suspicious enough. Less than 2 hours later, my son was about to prove it. The rehearsal dinner finally wrapped up shortly after 9. Guests began drifting toward the elevators, valet drivers pulled cars up to the front entrance, and the event space gradually cleared out. I was ready to head back to my hotel room and erase the entire evening from my memory when Ethan stepped up to my side once more. "Dad, can we talk for a minute?" he asked. There was a subtle shift in his voice. The calm composure was still there, but underneath it lay a weight I couldn't quite define. We walked side by side toward the parking garage and got into his truck. As soon as the doors shut, the noise of the city vanished. Ethan didn't start the engine, nor did he look over at me. For a long moment, he just stared straight ahead at the steering wheel. "Before I show you this, I need your word that you'll let me finish everything before you say anything." I frowned, my chest tightening. "Finish what?" "Just give me your word," he insisted. That alone made my stomach drop. Ethan was never one for drama or games. Whatever he had was serious. "All right," I replied. "You have my word." He reached into the center console, pulled out his phone, and opened a folder stored with recorded audio files. There were dozens of them, labeled by dates and times, stretching back several weeks. My confusion deepened as I stared at the screen. "What is all this?" I asked. For the first time all evening, Ethan turned and looked directly into my eyes. "The reason I asked you to stay tonight," he said quietly, before pressing play. At first, the speaker output only low ambient sounds, clinking glassware, faint music, and distant chatter. Then a distinct voice cut through the static. It was Chloe. She sounded relaxed and completely unfiltered, nothing like the sweet, polished woman she presented to the world. "6 more weeks," she said on the track. "After that, everything gets a whole lot easier." A second voice chimed in, her mother, Eleanor. "And what about his father's land?" Chloe gave a slight laugh. "Ethan is the simple part. Once the papers are signed, I'll start pushing the property sale. My father already has commercial buyers lined up." I sat up straight, my breath catching in my throat. The recording kept playing. Eleanor asked, "And if the old man digs his heels in?" Chloe answered without a second of hesitation, "He won't. Men like him blindly trust their sons. That's what makes this so easy."
The interior of the truck suddenly felt suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't even angry yet. I was completely bewildered because none of it made sense. The buyers, the property deal, or the cold confidence in Chloe's voice. The clip finished, leaving a heavy silence in the cab. Ethan didn't rush to break it, knowing I needed time to process what I had just heard. "Tell me I'm misunderstanding this," I finally managed to say. Ethan let out a slow breath. "I wish you were." He then tapped the screen to open another directory packed with images, scanned documents, text message chains, and legal forms. "How long have you known about this?" I asked, looking from the screen to his face. "Long enough to know that comment in the lobby wasn't an accident," he replied. Suddenly, Chloe's joke, Sterling's endless questions about the farm, and every awkward interaction over the last 18 months clicked into a terrifying picture. Yet I still hadn't grasped the full extent of what they were planning. When Ethan pulled up the next file, I realized the audio recording was only a fraction of their scheme. The file wasn't an audio clip. It was a detailed digital map. At first glance, it resembled a civil engineering proposal complete with color-coded boundaries and survey lines traversing regional plots. Ethan zoomed in on a specific section. My farm sat directly in the middle of a highlighted red zone. "What am I looking at here?" I asked. "A major state highway extension project, one that hasn't been made public yet." I stared at the blueprint. "How did you get your hands on this?" Ethan pulled up official county records, preliminary proposals, and internal land assessments. Some were public domain, but many were clearly confidential. The realization hit me like a cold wave. "Dad, if this route gets finalized, land values along this exact stretch are going to skyrocket." Immediately, every strange question Chloe had ever asked about the acreage, soil conditions, and access roads flooded back.
She hadn't been taking a friendly interest. She had been conducting real estate research. "How much are we talking about?" I asked quietly. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Based on the preliminary valuations, anywhere from 8 to 12 times its current worth." I sank back into the truck seat. 32 acres, passed down through 3 generations. Land my father had worked until his hands were raw. Land my grandfather fought to keep during the Great Depression. To my family, it was our heritage. To the Kensingtons, it was merely an asset to be flipped. Ethan tapped another document, opening an email thread between names I didn't recognize, discussing private acquisition strategies. One name appeared repeatedly: Sterling Kensington. "He's behind this," I said, my voice hardening. "He's leading it," Ethan confirmed, bringing up a scanned PDF. For a few seconds, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. My full name, Arthur Miller, was typed at the top, and my signature was affixed to the bottom line. It looked convincing, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed it. "What on earth is this?" I demanded. Ethan opened several more files, each containing fraudulent agreements, tentative land release forms, and unauthorized transfer applications bearing forged versions of my signature, complete with fake notary stamps. "These are complete fabrications," I said. "Do you know who forged them?" Ethan looked at me somberly. "I think you already know." A sharp wave of anger washed over my initial confusion. It wasn't just about the financial greed or the illegal paperwork. It was the sheer arrogance of their plan. They had looked at my entire existence, my family's legacy, and decided it could all be reduced to forged documents. They never bothered to ask, negotiate, or treat me like a person with my own choices. They had simply taken it for granted that they could steal what belonged to me. "How long has this scheme been in motion?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "At least a year," Ethan replied. I closed my eyes as the truth settled in. A whole year, all while I welcomed Chloe into my home, shared meals with her family, listened to her elaborate wedding plans, and watched my son prepare for a future he believed was genuine. The entire time, a ruthless operation was running quietly behind the scenes. Ethan tapped his phone once more. "Dad, there's something else you need to see." I opened my eyes. "There's more?" "Much more," he whispered, swallowing hard. "The worst part isn't just what they wanted to take, it's how they planned to force your hand." When he opened the next video clip, I understood why he had stopped me from walking out of that hotel lobby earlier. I thought I was ready for whatever came next, but I wasn't. Ethan turned the screen toward me.
The video showed Sterling Kensington sitting alone in a wood-paneled home office, recorded secretly from a hidden angle. He was examining a stack of legal files on his desk. Moments later, another man entered the room, and the two began discussing development timelines, land values, and acquisition strategies. Sterling pointed directly at a folder near his hand. Even on the small screen, I could clearly read my last name printed on the label tab. "The Miller property is our top priority," Sterling declared on the recording. "Everything relies on securing control of that parcel before the state announcement goes public." My chest grew tight. The other man asked how he planned to secure it if I refused to sell. Sterling smirked. "Chloe has already handled the hard part. The old man trusts his son, and the son trusts her." The video cut off. I sat completely frozen. Ethan stayed silent, letting the evidence speak for itself. Additional recordings followed in quick succession. Over the course of several months, Ethan had systematically documented every piece of evidence he could lay his hands on. Some came from overheard discussions, others from files left unattended, and some from associates who had no clue they were exposing a massive fraud. Piece by piece, a disturbing truth emerged. The romance had not brought about the land scheme. The land scheme had created the romance. That realization hit me harder than any financial threat. I had spent months assuming my son had simply fallen for a woman with a difficult family. The reality was far more sinister. Evidence clearly showed that Chloe had only shown interest in Ethan after her family learned about the upcoming state highway corridor. Every memory of their relationship suddenly felt contaminated. Every holiday dinner, every smile, every photograph. I looked over at my son. "When did you first start suspecting her?" "About 3 months ago," Ethan said, staring out through the windshield. "What tipped you off?" "She made a careless mistake. She dropped her guard." Ethan opened a short audio snippet. Chloe was talking to a friend over drinks, her tone cold and condescending. "Honestly, the father is way easier to handle than I expected," she said on the recording. Her friend laughed, asking, "You mean Ethan?" "No, Arthur. The son asks questions, but the old man just trusts people. That's why this is going to be so easy." Hearing my name spoken like a target made my blood run cold. The clip ended, leaving a heavy silence in the truck. "She didn't realize I was standing right behind the patio door," Ethan said quietly. That single moment had shattered the entire illusion. It revealed how she truly viewed us, not as human beings or future family, but as obstacles to be manipulated. "Why didn't you confront her right then?" I asked without hesitation. "Because I needed absolute proof," Ethan replied without hesitation. "If I called them out too early, they would have destroyed the paper trail, erased messages, and flipped the narrative.
I had to let them believe they were winning. Looking at him, I finally grasped the immense burden my son had been carrying for months. Smiling through wedding preparations, standing next to a woman who was actively trying to ruin his family, waiting patiently until he had enough evidence to destroy her plan completely. "So what happens now?" I asked. Ethan looked at me with a steady, unshakable focus. "The wedding is tomorrow," he said. "They think they're about to execute their victory lap." He reached into his coat, pulled out a small USB flash drive, and placed it in my hand. They aren't. I drove back to my hotel well past midnight, but sleep was out of the question. The USB drive sat undisturbed on the nightstand beside my bed. I didn't need to plug it in. I had already seen and heard more than enough. Every time I shut my eyes, Chloe's condescending remarks replayed in my mind. Every time I opened them, I pictured my family's land trapped in the middle of that state blueprint. By sunrise, the weight of the situation was still pressing heavily on my chest. Around 8 in the morning, Ethan called and asked me to come over to his place. When I arrived, another young man was already set up in the living room. His name was Marcus, one of Ethan's longtime friends who worked in audiovisual production for corporate conferences. Laptops, hard drives, cables, and high-powered projectors were arranged neatly across the dining table. Ethan looked up and gave me a subtle nod. "We're wrapping up the final edits." I realized immediately what was happening. The wedding wasn't an event anymore. It was a trap. Marcus pulled up a master file and projected it on the wall. The presentation brought together audio clips, property records, high-resolution photographs, text chains, and video snippets into an uninterrupted sequence. Every claim was backed by undeniable proof. There were no emotional speeches or wild accusations, just raw, verifiable evidence presented step by step. Watching it felt less like reviewing a wedding video and more like observing a high-level prosecution case. "Did the venue management approve setting all this equipment up?" I asked. Marcus offered a small grin. "They think it's a special tribute presentation organized by the groom." I almost let out a brief, bitter laugh. The irony was overwhelming. The Kensingtons believed they were walking into a triumphant celebration, completely unaware that they were stepping into the public destruction of their own scheme. Ethan double-checked the sequence. The audio recordings would play first, followed by the fraudulent property documents and the forged signatures. Every reveal was timed to build momentum, leaving no room for excuses or misinterpretation. Looking at my son, I saw that the anger and hurt had completely vanished, replaced by pure, cold clarity. "You can still walk away from this, Ethan," I said softly. "You don't have to turn your own wedding into a public showdown." He looked at me for a moment before turning back to the screen. "If I just walk away quietly, Dad, they'll just move on and do this exact same thing to another family." His words settled over me, and I knew he was right. People who build their lives on cold calculation don't stop just because one deal falls through. They simply look for their next mark. Any lingering hesitation I had vanished completely. Whatever came next, I was going to stand right beside him. By noon, every single detail was locked in place. The media file was rendered, the equipment was secured, and the arrival of the guests was only a couple of hours away. As I put on my suit jacket and prepared to head to the venue, Ethan caught my arm near the door. "Dad," he said, holding my gaze with absolute seriousness, "no matter what breaks loose in that hall today, do not try to stop me." The look in his eyes made it crystal clear that he was fully prepared for the explosion that was about to follow. The ceremony commenced precisely at 2 o'clock. Every seat in the grand ballroom was taken. Friends, business partners, extended relatives, and longtime neighbors sat dressed in their finest attire, exchanging cheerful small talk while waiting for the proceedings to begin. Scanning the room, it was obvious that not a single guest suspected they were about to witness anything other than a beautiful union. The Kensingtons certainly didn't. Sterling moved through the crowd with supreme confidence, shaking hands and taking congratulations like a businessman who had just sealed a massive deal. Eleanor smiled effortlessly for photos, conversing gracefully with the guests. Chloe looked stunning in her gown, greeting everyone with the exact same refined warmth she had displayed for the past 2 years. If she felt any underlying tension, she masked it brilliantly. Ethan stood at the front beside the officiant, calm and unreadable. To anyone else, he looked like a composed groom waiting for his bride. To me, he looked like a man about to detonate a bomb. The music swelled, cutting off the background chatter. Everyone turned towards the entrance as Chloe appeared at the back of the aisle, holding on to her father's arm. Smiles spread across the room, and a few guests wiped away tears. Sterling looked triumphant, carrying the expression of a man who believed every piece of his plan had fallen perfectly into place. They made their way down the aisle, step by step, row by row, towards a future that was already crumbling beneath them. When Chloe reached the front, she kissed her father on the cheek and took her position beside Ethan. The officiant began the ceremony, and for the first few minutes, everything proceeded as standard. Then came the moment. "Ethan Miller," the officiant read, "do you take Chloe Kensington to be your lawfully wedded wife?" An expectant silence fell across the hall.
Ethan looked directly at Chloe. She offered him the same sweet, radiant smile she had used at family dinners, parties, and holidays, the smile that had convinced everyone she was genuine. Then Ethan spoke into the microphone. "Before I answer that question, there is something everyone in this room needs to see." Instant confusion rippled across the room. The officiant blinked in surprise. Chloe's warm smile began to freeze, and Sterling's head snapped toward the back of the venue. In that exact second, the massive projection screen behind the altar illuminated.
At first, no one understood what was playing. The image displayed Chloe sitting at a dimly lit restaurant table. A second later, her recorded voice echoed clearly through the hall speakers. 6 more weeks, her voice stated. After that, everything gets a whole lot easier. A few guests exchanged bewildered glances. The recording played on. Once the papers are signed, I'll start pushing the property sale. My father already has commercial buyers lined up. The room grew dead silent. Every head turned from the screen to the bride standing at the altar. Chloe's face instantly drained of all color. Eleanor stopped breathing, and Sterling surged halfway out of his seat before sinking back down. The second recording blasted through the audio system without delay. "And if the old man digs his heels in?" Eleanor's recorded voice asked. Chloe's laugh followed. "He won't. Men like him blindly trust their sons. That's what makes this so easy." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Guests pulled out their phones, taking photos of the screen. Eleanor looked like she was on the verge of fainting, while real tears began streaming down Chloe's face, not out of remorse, but from the sudden, terrifying loss of control. "Ethan, please," Chloe pleaded, her voice trembling. "We can talk about this privately." For the first time since stepping up to the altar, emotion showed on my son's face. Not anger, but cold disappointment. "You had 18 months to be honest with me." The hall fell dead silent as the final slide appeared on the wall, a complete timeline proving that discussions to acquire our land had begun months before Chloe and Ethan even started dating. The implication hit every person in the room simultaneously. This was never a real relationship. It was a premeditated scam. For several long seconds after the final image faded, complete silence hung over the ballroom. Then the entire room erupted. Guests began talking over one another, chairs scraped loudly against the floor, and dozens of phones recorded the unfolding disaster. The elegant wedding had collapsed into a scene no one present would ever forget. Sterling Kensington was the first to charge toward the back of the hall, pointing aggressively at the media booth. Shut it down immediately." His voice boomed across the room, but no one listened. Marcus remained securely inside the locked booth, and the damage was already done. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Sterling spun around to face Ethan, his expression furious. "You have no idea what you've just done." Ethan stood at the altar without flinching. "Actually, I know exactly what I've done." The contrast between the two men was absolute. One was spiraling into utter panic, while the other had meticulously planned this moment for months. Eleanor sat frozen, staring blankly at the wall as her polished posture completely dissolved. Chloe looked even worse. Her makeup was ruined by tears as she scanned the crowd for help, only to find former friends averting their eyes and relatives whispering in disgust. Before the chaos could escalate further, a man in the third row stood up. His calm demeanor immediately drew everyone's attention. "My name is David," he announced clearly. "I'm a senior prosecutor with the County District Attorney's Office." The room quieted instantly. Arthur looked toward the Kensingtons. "I attended today as a personal guest, but based on the evidence displayed here, including corporate fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy, I highly advise everyone involved to stay right where they are." Whatever hope the Kensingtons had left evaporated on the spot. This was no longer just a ruined wedding, it was a criminal matter. Sterling tried to protest, but Arthur shut him down calmly, noting that law enforcement was already on its way. 3 of Ethan's friends quietly stepped into position near the doors, ensuring no one made a sudden exit. Realizing there was no escape, Chloe collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Watching the scene play out, I didn't feel anger, only a massive wave of relief. Months of heavy suspicion and stress lifted off my shoulders all at once. 20 minutes later, uniformed officers entered the hall and escorted the Kensingtons out, signaling the start of their real nightmare.
The wedding came to a sudden halt that afternoon, but the real fallout was just beginning. Within days, law enforcement investigators seized every audio clip, document, email, and video Ethan had assembled. What had unfolded as a public confrontation quickly escalated into a formal criminal investigation. Forensic analysts reviewed the sound files and verified they were untampered. Handwriting specialists analyzed the signatures on the land documents and confirmed what I already knew in my heart. They were complete fabrications.
As investigators dug deeper into the family's background, the Kensington situation deteriorated rapidly. Financial audits uncovered massive, hidden debts, concealed behind years of manufactured luxury. Their business accounts were drained, loan defaults were piling up, and bad investments had wiped them out. The image of wealth and influence they projected was nothing more than a fragile facade. They hadn't targeted my land out of simple greed, they targeted it out of sheer desperation. Yet desperation was no excuse for fraud and deception. As news of the scandal spread, other victims began stepping into the light. A woman from Arizona contacted authorities after recognizing the Kensingtons in national news reports. Years earlier, she had been involved with one of Sterling's business partners, experiencing a nearly identical pattern where conversations quickly pivoted towards family properties, inheritances, and financial assets. She had walked away before any damage was done, but her story matched the Kensingtons' tactics perfectly. Soon, additional individuals came forward with similar accounts. The exposure at the venue hadn't just stopped one scheme, it gave long silent victims the courage to speak up. Several months later, before the trial went to trial, defense attorneys representing the Kensingtons requested a private settlement meeting. Ethan and I sat across from them in a downtown conference room. Their offer was substantial, a massive financial payout, public retraction statements, and a request to drop all criminal charges. The sum was large enough to make anyone pause. After all, 32 acres of farmland doesn't make a man rich, and the money was life-changing. But sitting there, I realized the payout wasn't about making amends. It was about buying their way out of accountability. When the attorneys finished talking, the room fell silent. They looked at us expectantly. Ethan glanced over at me, and I already knew my answer. "No," I said firmly. The lead lawyer frowned, asking why. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Because if we take your money and sweep this under the rug, someone else will become their next target." The settlement meeting ended immediately, and trial preparations moved forward. Months of gathered evidence culminated in a courtroom setting. By the time opening statements began, prosecutors had secured an airtight case filled with financial records, expert analysis, verified audio, and witness testimonies. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw genuine fear in Sterling Kensington's eyes. The arrogance that had carried him through boardrooms and high society parties had completely evaporated. Nearly a year after the ruined wedding, the jury returned with a guilty verdict across all counts. Sterling received the harshest sentence, while Eleanor received significant prison time for her involvement in the conspiracy. Chloe sat in silence as her sentence was handed down, looking like someone who finally understood that actions carry undeniable consequences. When it was over, Ethan and I walked out of the courthouse together into the afternoon sun. Justice had been served, and there was nothing left to say. 2 years have passed since that day, and our lives look vastly different now. Ethan continues his work in land management, but he spends most of his days back on the farm. About a year after the trial, he met a wonderful woman named Tanya, a soil scientist who cared far more about genuine human connection than wealth or status. She never asked about property valuations or commercial development. The very first thing she asked was how my late wife used to bake her famous pecan pie. That was the moment I knew she truly belonged. They were married right beneath the pecan trees on our land, surrounded by true friends, loving family, and people who genuinely cared for them. No grand ballrooms, no hidden motives, just pure honesty. Looking back, I occasionally think about that moment in the hotel lobby when Chloe called me the maintenance guy. For a split second, I had felt small. What I know now is that her insult was never really about me. People who measure human worth by money, power, or appearances only reveal the emptiness inside themselves. The land is still here, the trees continue to grow, and my family's name remains proudly attached to every single acre. Sitting on the porch each evening, watching the sunset over the fields my father once worked, I am reminded of a vital lesson. Never shrink yourself to make someone else feel bigger. Truth may take its time, but when it finally arrives, it doesn't knock. It walks straight through the front door.
If this story resonated with you, let me know where you're tuning in from and how you would have handled things in Ethan's shoes.